Thanks for joining us once again on Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. It's been 62 years since the Cuban Revolution began. It's been 54 years since the Bay of Pigs invasion, 53 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, 26 years since the end of the Cold War, and 15 years since the Elian Gonzalez incident. And yet, it is just now that we are beginning a new relationship with our neighbor 90 miles away. A significant part of our population has come of age with absolutely no knowledge of the history of the U.S.-Cuba relationship, what the Cuban Revolution was about, or what all the hostility has been about. And yet the history of that relationship with Cuba has been a kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding the bias, the mistakes, and the domestic politics behind so much of American foreign policy from the mid-20th century until today. Few have had the access to Cuba to provide the kind of clear and present perspective that Tom Hayden has. Tom Hayden was a leader in the student and anti-war and civil rights protests throughout the 60s, and it is my pleasure to welcome him here to Radio Who, What, Why to talk about his new book, Listen, Yankee, Why Cuba Matters. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for your interest.
My pleasure. I want to talk first about your first journey to Cuba back in 1968 and a little bit about what that was like when you first went to the country.
It was a time of revolutionary excitement and tension. It was January 1968. I was involved in a radical phase of my political history. It was going to be the year of all the uprisings by students and young people around the world, including San Francisco State here in the Bay Area, Columbia, the Chicago trial. And Cuba was very much part of it because the Cubans had become the first country, a small country that had actually thrown off the dominance of the superpower, our government, after more than a century of that kind of control by the U.S. And Cuba was admired around the world in the majority of countries, and was the leader of the non-aligned movement at the United Nations. And we had, of course, invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and attempted by overt and covert manner to bring their government to heel, so to speak, and force them into a submissive role to the purposes of American foreign policy. So it was that moment, and I was interested. I was impressed. Anybody who goes to Cuba even now feels there's something warm and interesting about the people, but they were very exceptionally courageous because it's a pretty fragile situation when you've been threatened with nuclear annihilation and a superpower is 90 miles away, and you're doing everything in the world to stir things up against the superpower. So it was the most heady time in a very long history.
At that point, how much of the U.S. reaction to Cuba and the Cuban Revolution was really with respect to the fervor of the revolution itself, or part of the larger Cold War context and Cuba coming within the Soviet sphere of influence at the time?
It's a good question. I don't know how to analyze the balance there. This is a book about how the mutual recognition came about on December 17th. It's a long story, but I also relied on many hours, scores of hours of interviews with Ricardo Alarcón, who was a student leader in my generation, who became the president of the National Assembly, the foreign minister, and the UN ambassador. So I have pieces of it, and certainly, some on the U.S. side of the argument said repeatedly that it was about the Cold War, and that Cuba was being used as an instrument of the Soviet Union's power abroad in Africa, at the UN, and in Latin America. And if they would only break from the Soviet Union, they were entitled to their revolution. Others said, no, it started with animosity to the revolution itself in 1959 through 61, when the Soviet Union was not a factor. So that's a discussion that will play out. But the major point is that when the Soviet Union passed away or dissolved in the late 80s, the animosity toward Cuba continued. It was no longer possible to say that they were an instrument or a pawn of the Soviets, since the Soviets weren't there. And then it became, well, what is the problem? And then the underlying U.S. policy of regime change, wherever there's a government that's hostile, that threatens American private commercial or investor interests. It's an example to other countries, say in Latin America, that they too have to go, and that hostility remained up to the present by certainly an element, a leading element of the American foreign policy establishment.
What's so remarkable about that on both sides of the equation is how many leaders of the original Cuban Revolution began to, and you talk a little bit about this, really began to age out and gray themselves. At the same time, so many of those that were so anti-Cuba early on in the Cold War really began to fade out here, yet there was something about that hostility that stayed deeply rooted in the DNA of American foreign policy.
The book makes a comparison between revolution and life, and there are stages. There's youthful idealism and romance and love, and there's the gaining of power and the accomplishment of things, and contradictions set in. Enemies don't go away. Some of the enemies are within. But my thesis is that power ages, just like I'm getting old, power gets old. And we're at a point where the people that were fighting at the Bay of Pigs to take back Cuba under the direction of the U.S. CIA are now dead, dying, or in their 80s. They've become less of a factor in Florida politics. The new generation of Cuban Americans who grew up after the Cuban Revolution and have lived most of their lives after the Cold War voted for Obama twice in 2008, 2012. And that's a big factor in changing the politics of Florida and changing the domestic factors of our policy towards Cuba. Even some of the oldsters, like some of the old sugar barons, are back interested in making agricultural deals. And many, many people in their 50s, in their 60s, in their 70s want to visit Cuba freely, not because they've changed their mind about communism, but because they have ancestors buried there, or they long for a Cuban restaurant in Havana, or they want to see a musical performance, or they want to tour the island. So that was a major factor in altering the equation before Obama enunciated what he wanted to do.
One of the ironies, it seems, at least on the surface, is that the stated goal of U.S. policy for so long being regime change, it was the one thing that Cuba had to make sure didn't happen. And that now that there might be a greater normalization in those relationships, it may allow the framework in Cuba for the kind of regime change we would have liked to have seen years ago.
Exactly, it's possible. One of the striking things about the agreement is that Obama concluded that regime change was a policy that had failed for 55 years. And as he so stated, it makes no sense to continue a policy that has failed for 55 years and think that it will succeed. I thought that was classic Obama, the lawyerly statesman making the plain case. But since no one else had agreed with that position for 55 years, since everybody else wanted regime change, it's a startling statement of, I suppose, failure. On the other hand, a success for the Cuban Revolution, for the Cuban government, for the one-party state having prevailed. And that will be, noticed by people in Cuba and people around the world that the Cubans somehow made it. Having said that, I think that the policy of the United States, at least an element in our government, continues to be regime change, in the sense that they think that American consumers, American dollars, American dialogue with the Cubans, and some funding for some democracy projects on the island will bring about the end of the communist state and some unknown future in which there'll be markets and American investment. They may be right, they may not, but peaceful regime change is different than a bloodbath or a civil war. And obviously the Cubans have been prepared for this question for a very long time, and they're insisting on self-determination. They want to change their government. They want to move to a multi-party system. It's their business, and they will do it in their own time. And there certainly are plenty of people on the island who want a more democratic process, a more democratic political process than they have. And they're burdened, frankly, by the allegation that if they want more democracy and more reform in Cuba, they must be agents of the Americans. They must be covertly funded. And you know what? In many cases, the charges are true. The State Department has covertly funded these kind of programs. It's a funny policy to think that you can secretly bring about an open society in another country. I think Obama is right to try to hold back. What's in the current budget before Senator Leahy, who's been the spearhead of this process, is a blank for U.S. assistance programs to Cuba. So I assume that is an element that is still to be resolved by the Congress and the Cubans. I can't imagine the Cubans going ahead and approving further secret programs in Cuba, but the outcome is to be awaited.
Who is it that the Cuban right in this country, people like Rubio and Menendez, who do they think that they're representing at this point?
I don't know, but certainly it's a boomerang effect. In their efforts to liberate Cuba, they've brought a real blight, a cancer on the American political process. If you chart their history from the allegations around the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs, all the way to Watergate, the Cuban exiles were the Watergate burglars. The blowing up of the car of a Chilean foreign minister in Washington. They have acted like they have carte blanche, and they're a state within a state. They operate flights and all kinds of subversive efforts from sanctuaries in Florida against Cuba, and they've operated largely with impunity until now. I think that they are a business, like a mafia, and I think their agenda is to overthrow the Cuban government without any question, and they are now being forced to accommodate and They don't like it, but I don't think they have the power to fundamentally reverse what's going on. It's Senator Menendez represents Cuban exiles in Jersey, and Senator Rubio in Florida. Diaz-Balart's family comes from Cuba. Ross Letzinen's family, Cuba. And in the course of writing this book, I mean, many members of Congress on the liberal side told me that it was impossible to change policy because these people were just too strong, too well organized, not going to happen. And I think they themselves maybe fell prey to a kind of triumphalism that they had a lock. They knew how to monopolize politics enough that all Cuba policy would have to run through them. And that's why Obama had to take the extraordinary step of recognizing Cuba simultaneously and unilaterally with Raul Castro, and doing everything that he could within his executive power to fulfill that effort to achieve recognition. The deal that made it so important was that Cubans wanted 5 of their people back, the so-called Cuban Five, who were in prison, some for life, for having been intelligence officers caught trying to monitor Cuban exile pilots flying out of Florida towards the airspace of the island. The United States wanted Alan Gross, an aid worker who was funded for the covert smuggling of high-tech communications devices to the Jewish community in Havana, and had made 5 trips before he was picked up. So for the past several years, people have been intensely fighting over whether there could be a trade of some kind, and almost nobody thought it was possible. It was incredible, but that's what happened on the day of December 17th, the so-called milagro, the miracle. The remaining 3 came back, and Alan Gross came back here at the same time, and were warmly welcomed by their families and people. So credit to Obama for that. I think it came from the tremendous work of Senator Patrick Leahy, Tim Reeser on his staff, Barbara Lee here in the Bay Area had something to do with it. But without that pressure on the American side to get Gross back, might not have happened, despite Obama's wishes. Or it was an obstacle that had to be overcome. And the full story is incredible. It involves the U.S. State Department arranging artificial insemination for one of the Cuban Five so that his wife in Havana could get pregnant. And that's why when you see that arrival photo at the Havana International Airport and you see the woman hugging her husband fully pregnant, it set people off saying, what is this? He's been in solitary confinement. Why is his wife having a baby? And it was because the State Department, as a goodwill gesture, or Senator Leahy's office, as a goodwill gesture, made that possible, made that happen. And that was crucial to confidence-building measures that led to the final decision.
How much of a role will the Cuban diaspora here in the U.S. play in continuing to move these relationships along and build on the events of December 17th?
Well, I'm going to speak in Miami in 2 weeks. We'll see what the response there is. Probably a little better than Berkeley last night in terms of intensity and fervor and anger, and God knows. They're very unsettled. It's like their world has come undone. On the other hand, Jeff, as many as 400,000 travel to Cuba a year. I don't think Americans know that. You have to dwell on that. So that's what you're talking about when you say diaspora. And they go to see family. They go to bring stuff. They go to visit the island. And a lot of discussions take place over the dinner table or on walks. They see that Cuba has a better healthcare system, perhaps, than we do. Free medicine, free schools. They feel that they have a lot more freedom of speech on the Miami side. I can see a mutuality there shaping up, but not under the threat of force, but simply the pressure of time and demographics. Communism is a factor in Cuba, but it's not what it was to the world many years ago. So I do think the Cubans from Cuba will influence American policy, and vice versa. The younger Cuban exiles will try to bring about reunification there. I think it's more hopeful than not. I really do.
Is there concern, and this is one of the things we heard immediately in the aftermath of December 17th, concern that there would be too much Western cultural influence that went into Cuba immediately following real normalization of relationships, and the impact that would have both culturally and economically?
Yes, there are some that have that concern. I would tell them that the Cuban people, the Cuban government, the Cuban tourist industry are not unaware of this question. They have 1 million Canadians visit the island per year, 1 million Europeans. So Western white people are not an unusual phenomena, walking the beaches or going to the baladars or the restaurants, and some of that will happen. But as my interviewee, Mr. Alarcón, joked, there's nothing in Marx or Lenin that requires that the state control the restaurants and barbershops. I think the Cubans are more interested in protecting their healthcare system, their school system, their core socialist programs, reviving agriculture, and they understand they're in a post-Cold War world to an extent. They have a lot of support, deep support culturally, but also politically and economically from Brazil, from Central America, from Latin America. So they have more than one region that they might turn to for balance against the United States. But yeah, no doubt it's coming, and it's going to divide. I think it will worsen racial divide in Cuba to an extent, and it will be very interesting for greater dialogue with African Americans and Afro-Cubans. That will be an extremely important ongoing discussion. It's already begun. People like Danny Glover, people like Barbara Lee, it's already begun, and I think our civil rights experience will interest and stimulate Afro-Cubans who face a racial gap that hasn't been fully addressed by any means.
How important is it for Cuba at this point for the embargoes to be lifted?
It's important symbolically, and it's important really. That cannot be done without the vote of the Congress. Right. What Obama's order does is expand the categories that give you permission to travel so that almost anyone can find a reason for being able to go to Cuba now without hassle or recrimination. I think the executive order also opens the way to credit cards. And the importance of credit cards is for anybody who's been to Cuba, you have to carry dollars, and there's no credit, and it's extremely hard to make exchanges. But if you can go to Cuba and pay for your hotel, your meals, your shopping with a U.S. credit card, which should be possible soon, that will hollow out the embargo from within, because U.S. dollars will be flowing in Cuba as they should, making the embargo more hollow and less significant. The other issue is Cuba was put on the state sponsors of terrorism list in 1982 I believe, by Reagan. And if it ever belonged there, and obviously doesn't now, Cuba is mediating the dispute between the guerrillas and the government in Colombia, for example. And if that gets lifted, that can be lifted by executive order by the president, and he intends to do that. But he can be blocked by 2/3 of the Senate, I believe, and that's going to be a fight with the Senate that Obama will have to win. The importance is that will allow international financial institutions to make normal loans to Cuba without fear that their assets are going to be seized or they're going to be prosecuted by the U.S. government. So that should open up the economic channels as well. What will remain as a spectacle, a kind of funny spectacle, will be a legislative proposal soon to make it possible for American tourists to go to the island as tourists. I kid you not. That requires Congress. So the embargo still means that tourism, is banned. So if you want to go as a tourist, you have to find another reason to go and fit into another category. That will be debated, and there'll be some Republicans, libertarians like Rand Paul, who probably will support it. Who wants to be forbidding Americans from traveling somewhere to lie on the beach? Well, a good number of members of Congress, apparently, including the Cuban Right, because they think that American tourist dollars will subsidize the Castro dictatorship, as they say. So that'll be a fight coming up soon. It'll be one step at a time, but I think the logjam has certainly been broken.
And finally, Tom, can we expect maybe to see the Obamas in Havana before the end of his term?
That's what I'm proposing. I'd say go spring break. But I don't know. I certainly think that they want to go. I certainly think they will go. It has to be measured against other priorities, such as their relationships with Congress. But it would have a tremendous impact. An African-American president in a country that is almost half of African ancestry. He would be welcomed there without cynicism. He would be welcomed with open arms. Cubans are, despite all of the antagonisms, a very, very friendly people. Everybody notices that, and so it would be heartfelt, I think, in the extreme. Of course, they know that even a black president can have a forked tongue, and so they'll be listening very carefully to what he says and trying to encourage him to take further steps. They'll be very interested in what he says about those democracy programs, those covert operations, what he says about the people who are opponents of the regime, who he visits, where he goes. But why not? I mean, I think it would seal the deal. I think it would be, a very joyous event for people on both sides of the old line.
Tom, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much yourself. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for listening on whowhatwhy.org radio. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share it and help other people find it by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do at Who, What, Why by visiting us at whowhatwhy.org/donate.